Come closer. Come closer. Today let me tell you about the Elves, the firstborn children of LOTR, the elder kindred who walk beneath the stars before sun or moon ever graced the sky. Well, settle yourself there by the fire, for this is no short tale, and it stretches back to the very dawn of days, long before the shaping of these lands you call home, long before the raising of the mountains or the delving of the seas as we know them now. You see, to speak of the Elves is to see the beginning of all things that have beauty and sorrow intertwined. For such has ever been the fate of the firstborn. Their story is one of awakening and wonder, of great journeys and terrible sundering, of light gained and light lost, and of an endless longing that burns in their hearts like a flame that can never be quenched. It is a tale of love so deep it shaped the world, and of grief so profound that it echoes still in every elven song you might hear flitting through the woods on a quiet evening. Now, before there were elves, before there was any living thing that walked or flew or swam in the waters of this world, there was ardor, and it was being shaped by the great powers, the Valar, those mighty spirits who entered into the world to prepare it for the coming of the children of LOTR. The one whom the O's call Eru, he who is above all, had conceived in the depths of his thought the firstborn and the secondborn, the elves and men, and the Valar labored long to make the world ready for their awakening. But there was strife even then, for Melkor, mightiest of the Valar, had turned to darkness and sought to claim ardor for his own, marring all that his brethren made, twisting their works and corrupting their designs. War there was in those ancient days, wars of powers that you and I can scarcely imagine, and the shape of the world was changed many times by the fury of those conflicts. Yet through all that turmoil, a place was prepared in the east of Middle Earth, far, far to the east of any land, you know, where a great mere lay still and beneath the wheeling stars. Cuiviénen, the water of awakening. It was called in the Elven tongue, and it was there, beside those quiet waters, that the Elves first opened their eyes. Think on that for a moment. Imagine what it must have been to be the very first, to open your eyes and see existence for the first time, with no memory of anything before, no knowledge of what anything was meant. Above them wheeled the stars in their eternal dance. And those stars were the first thing they saw, and the love of starlight has never left the elven heart. The stars were made by Voda, whom the elves call Elbereth, and she is beloved above all other Valar, among the firstborn, for she gave them that first sight of beauty in a dark world. They rose beside the waters, and they looked upon one another. And they were not alone, for Ilvatar had woken them in pairs, each elf with a companion, and so began the bonds of love among the elves that would prove stronger than any other force save death itself. And even death could not wholly sever those bonds. In those first days, they had no language, no words to describe the wonder they felt, but they were clever beyond measure, these firstborn. And swiftly they began to craft speech. They named themselves the Quendi, which means those who speak with voices, for they prized above all else their ability to form words and share thought through sound. To them, speech was the first great gift they gave themselves, born of necessity and wonder combined. They wandered the shores of Cuiviénen, and they explored the forests that grew dark and deep around that mere, and they were content for a time, for they knew nothing else and the world was new. They made music, for song came almost as naturally to them as speech, and they danced beneath the stars, and they loved one another, and children were born to them, the first generations of the elder kindred. But it was not all peace and wonder, no, for Melkor, whom we call Morgoth, the black enemy of the world, he knew of their awakening, for his spies were many, and he coveted these new beings. He sent shadows among them, and some elves who wandered too far from the light of their kindred's campfires vanished, and were none seen again. What befell them none can say for certain, but it is whispered, and I believe there is dark truth in the whisper, that Morgoth took them to his fortress of Utomno in the far north, and there, through torments unspeakable and sorcery beyond imagining, he twisted them and broke them and remade them into something other. Some say this is how the orcs came to be. Those foul creatures that have plagued the free peoples ever since, born of corruption and malice from beings that were once evil and free. If this is so, and I fear it is, then it is perhaps the most terrible of all Morgoth's countless crimes, for he did not merely destroy the innocent, he perverted them and made them into instruments of destruction themselves. This shadow fell upon the elves by Cuiviénen, and they grew fearful, and they huddled closer together, and they learned warriness, which was a bitter lesson for beings who had known only wonder. But the Valar in the west had not forgotten them. Indeed, the Valar had long awaited the awaking of the firstborn, and when it was known to them that the children had at last come forth, there was great joy in Valinor. Yet there was also concern, for they knew that Morgoth was abroad in Middle-earth, and they feared for these new beings, fragile in body compared to the great spirits, yet precious beyond measure. And so the Valar made war upon Morgoth. The war for sake of the elves, it has been called, and it was a war of such magnitude that the very shape of lands was changed. Mountains were cast down and raised anew, seas flooded where once was dry land, and the pits of Utumno were laid bare, and Morgoth was taken captive at last, and bound with chains crafted by All himself, chains called Angena that could not be broken by any strength. He was brought to Valinor in defeat and cast into the halls of Mandos, there to remain for 3 ages of the world. With Morgoth's fall, the Valar debated what should be done for the elves. Some counselled that they should be left in Middle-earth, free to wander and grow as they would. But others feared that the darkness left behind by Morgoth was too great, that his servants still lurked in the shadows, and would the elves would never flourish in such a wounded land. And there was another reason too, one born of love that was perhaps too possessive, for the Valar desired to have the elves near them, to protect them and guide them, and yes, to enjoy their company. For the Valar found great delight in these new beings, so different from themselves yet sharing in the secret fire of Elvatar. It was decided that the elves should be summoned to Valinor, to dwell in the light of the 2 trees, and be safe from all harm. But the Valar remember their error with Morgoth, how they had tried to force obedience, and reaped only resentment and rebellion. They would not compel the elves, but invite them, and the choice would be their own. So Aurum was sent, Aurum the hunter, Mycles and the Valar in deeds of arms, save only Tokas. He rode through Middle-earth on his great steed Nahar, whose coat was white as snow, and whose hooves could outpace the wind, and in time he came upon the elves by Cuiviénen. Imagine their terror at first, for here came a figure of such power and majesty as they had never dreamed, mounted on a beast that made the deer and horses they knew seem like toys. His horn rang through the forests, and the very trees seemed to tremble at his passing. Many elves fled, and hid, believing this was some great demon sent to devour them, perhaps one of those dark hunters that had taken their kindred before. But not all fled. Some few, the bravest, or perhaps the most curious, stood their ground and looked upon Aurum without fear, and what they saw was not terror but beauty. Terrible beauty, yes, but beauty nonetheless. And Aurum looked upon them with love, and he did not pursue those who fled but spoke gently to the remained, and in time, bit by bit, the elves came to know him. And they called him in their tongue Aurum, which means horn blowing, for the sound of his great horn Valar Mahal was the first thing they had known of him. Aurum dwelt among them for a time, and he told them of Valinor, of the light of the trees that was like nothing in Middle-earth, of the peace and safety and beauty awaited them in the west. And when he departed, he returned again and again, and with each visit he told them more, and slowly, slowly, he kindled in their hearts a desire for the west, a longing for the light. When the Valar deemed the time was right, they sent invitation through Aurum, summoning the elves to Valinor. But this was no command, no order that must be obeyed. It was an invitation, and each elf was free to accept or refuse as their heart counselled. But how does one choose such a thing when one has never seen what is offered? How does one weigh the familiar dark against a light one has only heard described? The elves were uncertain, and there was much debate among them, and some wished to go, and some wished to stay, and many knew not what they wished at all. To help them decide, the Valar proposed that ambassadors be chosen from among the elves, representatives who would journey to Valinor and see the light for themselves, and then return and tell their people what they had seen, so that all might choose with knowledge rather than ignorance. 3 were chosen, one from each of the 3 great groups in which the elves had by then divided themselves, for even in those early days, differences had emerged among the kindreds. Ingi was chosen from those who were fairest and most eager for the light. Finn was chosen from those who were most curious and skilled in craft, and El was chosen from those who were most numerous and most reluctant to depart, they who loved the shores and forests, and were least eager to leave what they knew. These 3 were borne away to Valinor by the power of the Valar, and they looked upon the light of the 2 trees, Telperion the silver and Lorien the gold, and they were filled with wonder and longing beyond any word they possessed to describe. When they returned to their people, they spoke of what they had seen, and their words were like fire, kindling desire in the hearts of many, but not all, for even after hearing the testimony of their ambassadors, some elves refused the summons. The world they knew was dark, yes, but it was their world. They had made their lives there. They had named the stars and the waters and the beasts. To leave all this for a light they had never seen, a land they did not know, seemed to them a kind of death. Better the familiar dark, they said, than the unknown light. These who refused we call the Avari, the unwilling, and they remained in the far east of Middle-earth, and little is known of their fate, for they passed out of the great tales, and their history became their own, separate from their kindred who departed. Some say they dwindled and faded. Some say they were enslaved or destroyed by the servants of Morgoth, who remained in the world, and some say they endured and still endure, in secret places far from the lands we know. I have met few of them in my long years, and they are wary and strange, remembering things that even the elves of the West have forgotten. But the majority chose to accept the summons, and they prepared for a great journey, a journey that would take them across the entirety of Middle-earth, from the far east to the western shores, and thence over the sea to Valinor itself. This was the great journey, one of the defining events in the history of the elves, and it was not accomplished in days or years, in the long, slow ages of the world's youth. 3 hosts set out, each led by one of the ambassadors who had seen the light. The first and smallest host was led by Ingi, and they were called the Manyar, the fair elves, for they were golden-haired and fairest of countenance. They were most eager of all for the light, and they pressed forward with greatest haste, never lagging, never doubting. The second host was led by Finn, and they were called the Nolder, the deep elves, for their minds were deep and curious, ever seeking knowledge of how things were made and might be made. They were dark-haired for the most part, and their eyes were keen, and even on that long march they stopped often to examine and plants and waters, wondering at their nature and composing songs about their discoveries. The third and greatest host was led by El, and his people were called the Teleri, the last, for they were always last in the march, always lingering, always reluctant to leave one thing before they had fully known it. Among them was El's brother Ol, who helped lead the great mass of the Telerin people, for they were by far the most numerous of the kindreds. The journey was long beyond telling. They crossed plains and mountains, forded rivers and traversed forests that had never known the tread of walking feet. Years passed, and the generations turned, for elves do not age as mortals do, but time passes for them nonetheless. And children were born on the march, who grew to adulthood knowing nothing but the journey, and some fell away. At each great obstacle, at each parting of ways, some chose to turn aside, to settle in the lands they found rather than press on to an unknown destination. These were not quite Avari, for they had accepted the summons and begun the journey, but they were not quite faithful either, and they became peoples apart, kindreds of elves who dwelt in Middle-earth, but whether wholly of the west nor wholly of the east. The first great sundering came when the hosts reached a great river, mighty beyond any they had yet crossed, and beyond it rose mountains dark and terrible. Mountains thrown up in the chaos of the war against Morgoth, jagged and threatening and wrapped in perpetual cloud. These were Hithagla, the misty mountains as you know them, though they are worn and diminished now from what they were then. Many of the Teleri quailed at the sight. They had grown weary of the march, and these mountains seemed to them impassable, a wall set against their progress by powers hostile to their journey. Some refused to go further, and they turned south, following the course of the river, and they became the Nanda, the ones who turned back. The leader was Len, and he led his people away into the south, and some of them in time found their way to the great forest, which you call Greenwood, and I once called Erin Gallen, and there made their homes and became the Sylvan Elves, the wood elves of later ages. Some went further still, into lands that have other names and other stories, but the main hosts pressed on, over the mountains by posses long lost and forgotten, and they came at last to the great lands of Beleriand, which lay then on the western shores of Middle-earth. Beleriand, a name to conjure with, though it exists no more, for it was drowned and broken at the end of the First Age, and its beauty passed forever beneath the waves. But in those days it was a land of wonder, with forests and plains and great rivers running down to the sea. It was there, in Beleriand, that the greatest sundering occurred, and the history of the Teleri was changed forever. El, who had led his people all the way from Cuiviénen, who had seen the light of the trees, and returned to guide his kindred to that El vanished. He had wandered into a forest called Nan Elmoth, a dark wood of ancient trees, and there he encountered something he had never expected, and could never have been prepared for, Million. Million was no elf but a Maya, one of the lesser spirits who served the Vala, though there was nothing lesser about her save in comparison to those great powers. She was of the people of both Vi, Na and Est, and her voice was so beautiful that the nightingales sang with her, and learned their music from her lips. She had come to Middle-earth before the awakening of the Elves, and she loved the twilight lands and the dark forests and the quiet places under the stars. When El saw her, standing the twilight with stars caught in her hair, he was struck still as if by a thunderbolt, and Melian looked upon him, this elf lord who beheld the light of Valinor, and something kindled in her heart that she had never felt before. They stood there, hand in hand, while the years passed and the stars wheeled overhead, and neither spoke, for what words could pass what passed between them in that timeless moment? His people searched for him, of course. They searched the forests and the hills, calling his name, for they loved the Lord and feared for him. But Nan Elmoth kept its secrets, and no trace of El could they find. Months passed, and then years, and still the Teleri waited, for they would not leave with their king. But the Valar grew impatient. The journey had already taken longer than they had wished, and news came from the east of stirrings in the dark places, of servants of Morgoth creeping forth from their hiding holes. The elf must come now, they insisted, or the opportunity might be lost. And so the hosts were commanded to move on, ready, or El's brother took up the leadership of the Teleri in his brother's absence, and with heavy hearts they resumed the march, but not all. A great number of the Teleri refused to leave, refused to abandon their search for their king. These stayed behind in Beleriand, and they were called the Egloth the Forsaken, though in time they would be known by another name, a name that would echo through all the ages of the world, the Cinder, the Grey Elves. They were not called grey for their appearance, but for their fate, for they were caught between light and dark, not having reached Valinor to see the light of the trees, yet not being Avari either, having travelled far on the journey. They were twilight elves, and their story would become intertwined with the history of Middle-earth in ways that none then could have foreseen. The remaining hosts pressed on, westward, always westward, until at last they came to the shores of the great sea, Belegaer, the sundering seas that lay between Middle-earth and the Owen lands. And there they halted, for none of them had ever seen the sea before, and its vastness overwhelmed them. You who have perhaps seen the sea, you may think you understand, but you do not. For in these diminished days the sea is tamed, bounded by shores you know, crossed by ships you have built. But to the elves who first stood on those western beaches, the sea was infinity itself, a vast moving wilderness of water that stretched to the very edge of the world and beyond. The Teleri especially were struck with and fear and a strange new love, for the sea spoke to something deep in their hearts, and they heard music in its ceaseless surge and sigh. The Vanir and Noldor were eager to cross, to reach Valinor at last, and look upon the light they had journeyed so far to see. But how? No ship had ever been built could cross such an expanse, and the elves had no knowledge of shipcraft, having never needed it in their long march overland. It was Omo who provided the answer. Omo, Lord of Waters, mightiest of the La, save man himself, he who loved the elves, and yet was reluctant to see them caged in Valinor. He offered to bear them across the sea. He took a great island that lay in the midst of the waters, an island that had once been a beacon set there by the Valar in ancient days, and he uprooted it from the sea and drew it east to the shores of Middle-earth. The Vanir and Noldor embarked upon this island, but the Teleri lingered. The sea had enchanted them, and they were not ready to leave its shores. They begged for time, and time was granted them, and so when Omo drew the island back across the sea, bearing the Vanir and Noldor to Valinor, the Teleri remained behind on the beaches of Beleriand. That island, by the way, did not return. When Omo brought it to the Bay of Eldamar, in sight of Valinor, it ran aground and came to rest, and there it remained, and it was named Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Isle. But that is another part of the tale, and I am getting ahead of myself. The Teleri dwelt on the shores of Beleriand for long years, and they learned the ways of the sea. They befriended Os, a Maial of Omo who loved the coastlands and the creatures that dwelt in the shallows, and he taught them much of the waters and their secrets. They learned to build boats and then ships, and they began to sail upon the sea, at first only along the coast, but in time venturing further and further from shore. And it was during this time that Ella at last emerged from Nan Almoth. The years of his enchantment had ended, though whether it was years or decades or even longer none can say for certain, for time moved strangely in that forest. He came forth with Melian at his side, and he was changed. No longer was he simply El of the Teleri, ambassador to Valinor. He was now Ilu Thingol, King Greymantle, and a light shone in his face that had not been there before. Not the light of the trees, but a different light, the light of love and of power borrowed from the Maya who had chosen him. The Sindar rejoiced at his return, and they made him their king, and Melian became their queen. Together Thingol and Melian established a realm in the great forest of Doriath, and there they built Menegroth, the 1,000 caves, a palace of such beauty that it was said to rival even the mansions of the Valar in Valinor. And Melian cast about Doriath of enchantment, the girdle of Melian, and none could pass through that fence against her will, neither elf nor beast nor any servant of evil. Thingol chose not as Yun the journey to Valinor. He had found his home, he had found his love, and he desired no other light than the light in Melian's eyes. And so the Sindar remained in Middle-earth, and they became in town the mightiest of the Elven peoples, who did not see the light of the trees. And their language and their culture would shape all the elves of Middle-earth in ages to come. But what of the Teleri on the shores? In time, their longing for Valinor grew again, and Ulmo heard the desire and sent Os to help them. Great ships were built, white ships with sails like wings, and this time the Teleri crossed the sea under their own power, sailing westward into the light. They came to Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle where the Vanir and Noldor had first landed, and there they stayed for a time, reluctant still to leave the sound of the sea entirely behind. Eventually they sailed on to Valinor itself, but they settled on the eastern shores at the place called Alqualund, the Haven of the Swans. where they could still look out upon the sea and sail its waters whenever they wished. Their ships were beautiful beyond description, shaped like great swans with prows that curved like the necks of those graceful birds, and they sailed with lights upon the masts that shone like stars. So the three kindreds came at last to Valinor, though not all and not unchanged. The Vanyar settled closest to the Velar, in the shadow of the great mountain Tanactil, where Anvada held their court. They became the most devoted of the elves to the Valar, and they learned much of their wisdom and their arts. In time, they passed beyond the knowledge of the other kindreds, dwelling in bliss in the light of the trees and desiring nothing more. The Noldor settled in the region of Tirion, upon the Hiving Tidna which rose in the Calasyria, the pass of light through which the radiance of the trees streamed eastward to light the shores and the lonely Isle. There they built a great city, white towers and crystal domes that caught and reflected the light, and they filled it with gems of their own making, for the Noldor were master craftsmen beyond any other people, and their works were things of wonder. And the Teleri, as I have said, dwelt at Alqualond, and they cared little for the works of the other kindreds, but devoted themselves to the sea and to music, and their voices rose and fell with the waves, and they were content. For long ages bliss reigned in Valinor. The Valar taught the elves, and the elves learned and grew in skill and wisdom. The two trees lit the land with their mingled radiance, silver and gold weaving together in an endless twilight that was neither nor night, but something lovelier than either. Children were born, and grew, and had children of their own, and the elven population flourished. Among the Noldor, Finn was king, he who had been the ambassador to Valinor in the days of the great journey. He took a wife named Mairiel, who was skilled in weaving and embroidery, and she bore him a son of such brilliance as had never before been seen among the elves. This was Eftanam, spirit of fire, and his story is central to all that follows, for good and for ill. Efanor was gifted beyond measure in both mind and spirit. He had a fire within him that drove him to create, to understand, to master every skill and craft. While still young, he devised the Tengwar, the letters that the elves use for writing, improving upon an earlier system and creating something more beautiful and more versatile. He studied the nature of light and color, and he made gems that surpassed any that had been made before, gems that seemed to hold light within them and release it slowly, glowing within a fire. But Efanor was not easy to love. His brilliance was matched by his pride, and his fire burned hot enough to scorch any who came too close. He quarreled with his father, he quarreled with his half-brothers, for Finn had remarried after Emuriel's death and had other sons, Fingolfin and Finolfin, and Efanor resented them and the love their father gave them. He was suspicious, jealous of his own works, sure to share his knowledge, and quick to take offense. Yet he achieved wonders. His greatest work was yet to come, a work that would shape the destiny of elves and the world itself. Efanor made the Silmarils. How can I describe them to you? I who have never seen them, who can only speak of what has been told and sung. They were gems, yes, but to call them merely gems is to call the sea merely water. They were 3 in number, and they held within them the light of the 2 trees, captured and preserved in a way that no one, not even Efanor himself, could fully explain. They shone with their own light, a light that was alive, that waxed and waned like breathing, that contained the very essence of Valinor's glory. The Valar hallowed the Silmarils, and Vada herself blessed them so that no mortal flesh, no unclean hand, could touch them without being burned. They were things of holy beauty, and even the Valar looked upon them with wonder and desire. Efanor loved them with a love that bordered on madness. He wore them on his brow at festivals, but at other times he kept them locked away, guarded jealously, shown to no one. His wife Nerdnel tried to warn him that his love was becoming possessive, unhealthy, but he would not listen. His sons, of whom he had 7, were raised in the shadow of those jewels, taught to prize them above all else. Meanwhile, in the halls of Mandos, Morgoth had served his sentence. 3 ages of the world he had been imprisoned, and now the Valar in their mercy or their folly released him. Do not imagine that Morgoth was reformed. The darkness in him was fundamental, woven into the very fabric of his being. But he was cunning, far more cunning than any the Valar gave him credit for, and he knew how to feign repentance. He appeared before man humbled and broken, claiming that his time in bondage had taught him the error of his ways. He begged to be allowed to aid the elves, to teach them and help them to make amends for his past crimes. Man, who was good beyond the capacity for understanding evil, believed him. The Valar released Morgoth from his chains and gave him freedom to walk among the elves, though he was not permitted to leave Valinor. For a time, Morgoth played his part perfectly. He spoke softly, he offered knowledge freely. He showed particular interest in the works of the Noldor, praising their craftsmanship and offering suggestions for improvement. Many of the Noldor were deceived, Fëanor not among them. For Fëanor mistrusted Morgoth from the start and refused to have any dealings with him. But Morgoth was patient. If he could not win Fëanor's trust, he could still use Fëanor's pride against him. Morgoth began to whisper rumors, to seed lies among the Noldor. He suggested that the Valar were keeping the elves in Valinor, not for their protection but to control them, to prevent them from ruling the world that was rightfully theirs. He hinted that the lands of Middle-earth were vast and beautiful, that the elves would be kings, there instead of subjects. He inflamed old jealousies between the sons of Finn, suggesting that Fingolfin was plotting to usurp Fëanor's position as firstborn and heir. These lies spread like poison through the Noldor. Even those who did not believe them could not help but be affected by them, for such whispers plant seeds of doubt that grow regardless of one's intentions. Fëanor became ever more suspicious of his half-brothers, ever more jealous of his treasures, ever more resentful of the Valar's authority. The crisis came when Fëanor publicly threatened Fingolfin with violence, drawing a sword in the Ring of Doom, where the Valar their counsels. This was an unprecedented breach of the peace, and the Valar could not overlook it. They summoned Fëanor and questioned him, and the truth of Morgoth's lies came out. But it was too late. The poison had done its work. Even after Morgoth was exposed and fled from Valinor, the suspicions and resentments he had nurtured remained, and Fëanor, who had been exiled from Tirion for 12 years as punishment for his transgression, only grew more bitter in his exile. Morgoth fled to the north, where Ungoliant dwelt. Ungoliant was a being of terrible power and malice, a spirit that had taken the form of a monstrous spider and devoted herself entirely to devouring light. No one knows for certain what she was originally, whether a Maya corrupted beyond recognition or something else entirely, something that crept into the world from the void outside. She had helped Morgoth in the early wars, but she had hidden herself away when he was captured, lurking in the dark places of the world and feeding on whatever light she could find. Morgoth came to her with a proposal. Help him strike one more blow against the Valar, he said, and he would feed her hunger beyond her wildest dreams. She agreed. Her hunger was endless, and Morgoth's promises were sweet. Together they crept back into Valinor, hidden in a darkness that Ungoliant wrapped around them, a darkness so profound that even the eyes of Maun could not pierce it. They came to the two trees, Telperion and Laurelin, those living lights that had illuminated Valinor since the beginning of the Elven Age. And Morgoth struck them with his black spear, wounding them deeply, and Ungoliant fell upon the wounds and drank the light that poured from them. She drank, and the trees withered and died, and darkness fell upon Valinor for the first time since the kindling of the trees. This was the darkening of Valinor, and the grief of that day has never been forgotten. The Valar were stunned, unable to comprehend what had happened. In their confusion and horror, Morgoth and Ungoliant escaped, fleeing northward back to Earth, and as they fled, Morgoth came to Formanos, the fortress where Fëanor had been exiled, where Finan had gone to be with his son. Fëanor was not there. He had been summoned to Valinor, to a festival where all the Noldor were gathering, a festival of reconciliation meant to heal the rifts that Morgoth's lies had created. But Finn was there, and the Silmarils were there, locked in a chamber of iron. Morgoth slew Finn, the first death by violence in Valinor, and he took the Silmarils and fled. When Eärnur learned what had happened, grief and rage consumed him utterly. His father was dead, murdered. His treasures were stolen. The light of the trees was extinguished, and the Valar who had released Morgoth against all wisdom, who had failed to protect his people. They came to him asking for the Silmarils. For Yavanna, who had made the trees, believed that if she had the light of the Silmarils, she might be able to rekindle the trees and restore their glory. But the Silmarils were gone, and even if they had not been, would Eärnur have given them? He who had loved them more than anything save, perhaps, his father, would he have surrendered them even to restore the light of Valinor? We will never know, for the question was never truly asked. Messengers came with news that Morgoth had escaped to Middle-earth, and Eärnur's path became clear to him. He would pursue Morgoth to the ends of the world. He would recover the Silmarils or die trying. And he would bring down vengeance on the head of the black enemy that would ring through all the ages of the world. This was the oath of Eärnur, and it was the doom of the Noldor. In the darkness of Valinor, lit only by the stars that had been made in ancient days for just such an emergency, Eärnur gathered the Noldor on the hill of Tidri. He was a figure of terrible beauty, his eyes burning with a fire that seemed to light the very air around him, his voice ringing out like a trumpet call to war. He spoke of wrongs and vengeance, of freedom from the Valar's restraint. A great realms waiting for them in Middle-earth. He reminded them that they were not native to Valinor, but to the mortal lands, and he called them to return, to make themselves kings and lords as they deserved to be. He spoke of Morgoth and of justice, and he swore an oath, a terrible oath that bound him and his 7 sons to pursue the Silmarils until the end of the world. By Elvatar himself they swore, by the everlasting darkness upon them if they should fail, to pursue anyone, be they Valar or Elf or any other being, who should keep a Silmaril from them. No one who heard the oath could mistake its portent. It was not merely a promise, but a curse, a binding of the soul to a purpose that allowed no exception, no mercy, no turning aside. Many of the Noldor were swept up in No's fire, particularly the younger generations who had grown restless in Valinor and longed for adventure. Even those who had doubts felt the pull of his words, and when he called for them to march, thousands answered. But to march they needed ships, and the Noldor had none. They had come to Valinor on Olmo's island, and they had never learned the art of shipbuilding as the Teleri had. So Eärnur led his host to Alcolund, the haven of the swans, to ask the Teleri for their ships. The Teleri refused. Their ships were to them as the works of the Noldor were to the Noldor, treasures beyond price, and besides, they said they would not aid in a rebellion against the Valar, whom they loved and honored. Eärnur was not accustomed to being refused. His anger, already burning hot from his father's death, flared into murderous rage. He ordered his people to take the ships by force, and when the Teleri resisted, the Noldor drew their swords. This was the first kinslaying, the first time elf shed elven blood, and it was a crime that would echo through all the ages that followed. The Teleri fought bravely, but they were overmatched, for the Noldor were greater in number and in arms. Many Teleri were slain on the white docks of their haven, and the waters of the harbour ran red with their blood. Some of the Noldor who came later to the battle did not understand what had happened. They saw their kindred fighting, and assumed the Teleri had attacked them, and they joined the battle on Eärnur's side. Even Fingolfin's people, who had no love for Eärnur, fought in that terrible hour, and they too shared in the guilt of the slaying. The ships were taken, and Eärnur led his host northward along the coast. But as they went, a great shadow fell upon them, and out of the darkness came a voice terrible and commanding. It was Mandos himself, or perhaps his herald. But the words were from the very throne of the Valar, and they have come to be known as the doom of the Noldor. Tears unnumbered ye shall shed, the voice proclaimed, and the Noldor shall be betrayed by their own kindred, and they shall fight in hopeless war, enduring evil ages of the world. The houses shall fail, and the children shall be scattered. The children of those who slew Kindreds shall live in darkness, and they shall return to the west only when the world is broken and remade. Many who heard the doom quailed and turned back, and among those who continued, many never reached Middle-earth at all. But Elfen laughed at the doom and marched on, and his fire carried the host forward into the darkness. They came to the Helcarax, the grinding ice, a treacherous waste of frozen sea and shifting bergs that lay between the far north of Valinor and the equally far north of Middle-earth. The ships could not cross this, and there were not enough ships to carry all the Noldor, even if the seas had been calm. And here Elfen committed his second great betrayal. He took the ships, and those of his people who were most loyal to him, and he crossed the sea to Middle-earth, leaving Fingolfin and all his host stranded on the western shore. When they landed on the far side, Elfen burned the ships. Whether he did this to prevent anyone from returning to Valinor, or to prevent the ships from being used by Fingolfin to follow him, or simply out of the madness of his grief and rage, none can say. But the flames of those ships were seen even from across the grinding ice, and Fingolfin knew then that his half-brother had betrayed him utterly. But Fingolfin did not turn back. He led his people across the Helcarax on foot, through cold that killed and ice that crushed and despair that gnawed at the soul. Many died on that crossing, and those who survived were hardened and embittered. Their love for Elfen turned to hate that would never fully heal. Meanwhile, in Middle-earth, Elfen began his war. Morgoth had not been idle. He had returned to his ancient fortress of Angband in the far north, which his servants had kept in his absence. There he set Hilf up as the Dark Lord of the world, and he bred armies of orcs and other foul creatures to serve his will. He wore the Silmarils in an iron crown upon his head, and the holy light burned him perpetually. But he would not give them up. Elfenor's host was attacked almost immediately upon landing, and thus began the first of the great battles between the Noldor and Morgoth. Elfen fought like one possessed, which perhaps he was, and the orcs could not stand against him. But in his fury he pressed too far ahead of his army, and he came within sight of Angband itself, and there he was ambushed. Balrogs surrounded him. Those terrible spirits of fire and shadow had been corrupted to Morgoth's service in the earliest days. There were many then, for the power of Morgoth was greater than it would later be, and even Elfen, mighty as he was, could not stand against so many. He fought long, slaying several of them, but at last Gotha, lord of Balrogs, struck him down with a mortal wound. His sons found him and bore him away, but they could not bear him far. Before they reached the safety of their camp, Fëanor died, and in his death his fire was released, and his body burned away to ash, and his spirit was caught by Mandos and held in the halls of the dead, where it remains to this day, and shall remain. They sail to the ending of the world. Before he died, Fëanor looked upon Angband from afar, and he cursed Morgoth and repeated his oath, binding his sons to continue the quest for the Silmarils no matter the cost. And his sons swore again, as their father had sworn, and they took up the burden of that terrible oath. Thus began the long war for the Silmarils, which lasted nearly 500 years and saw the rise and fall of elven kingdoms, the deeds of heroes beyond counting, and sorrows that would break your heart to hear. Fingolfin arrived in Middle-earth as the moon rose for the first time, for the Valar had made the moon and sun from the last fruit and flower of the dying trees, and they set them in the sky to give light to the world. The rising of the sun marked the first day of the First Age, and with it began the reckoning of time as we know it. Fingolfin defected Elfenor's sons about the burning of the ships, but there was little to be done. The host reunited grudgingly, and they established realms throughout the north of Beleriand, surrounding Morgoth's fortress on 3 sides and maintaining a siege that would last for centuries. The elves of the Noldor were mighty, and they achieved much in those years. They built kingdoms of beauty and power. They crafted weapons and jewels and works of art. They made alliances with the Sindar and with the dwarves, and they held Morgoth at bay. There were losses and victories, sorrows and joys, and stories that would take longer to tell than I have breath. But always the oath hung over them. Always the Silmarils burned in Morgoth's crown. Out of reach, and the sons of Ephraim grew ever more desperate to fulfill their vow. The second kinslaying came when Thingol was slain by dwarves over a quarrel involving a Silmaril. For one of the great jewels had been recovered from Morgoth's crown by a hero named Beren and his love Eluthael, and it had come into Thingol's keeping. The sons of Ephraim demanded it, claiming their right under the oath, but they were refused, and in their desperation they attacked the hidden kingdom of Dorioth. With Million gone, for she had departed to Valinor in grief after Thingol's death, the girdle was broken, and the sons of Ephraim were able to enter. They slew many elves, and 2 of the brothers died in the fighting, but the Silmaril escaped them, carried away by survivors to the Havens of Sirion. And so it went on, horror following horror, until the third kinslaying at the Havens of Sirion, where again the sons of Ephraim attacked their own kindred in pursuit of the Silmaril. More brothers died, and still the jewel escaped, for a woman named Elwing, who bore it, cast herself into the sea rather than surrender it. But Elwing did not drown. Ulmo, remembering his love for the elves, transformed her into a great white bird, and she flew across the sea to find her husband Eärendil, who had gone seeking the way to Valinor to plead for aid against Morgoth. Eärendil was half elf and half man. For in those days elves and men sometimes loved one another and had children, and such children were of both kindreds and neither, caught between mortality and immortality. With the Silmaril upon his brow, Eärendil sailed into the west, and the light of the jewel guided him through the shadows that guarded Valinor, for the Valar had set up barriers to keep the exiled Noldor from returning. He came before the Valar and pleaded for mercy, not for himself but for the elves and men who were dying under Morgoth's assault. He acknowledged the sins of the Noldor, the kinslayings and the rebellion, but he begged the powers to look beyond those sins and aid the innocent who were suffering. And the Valar listened. They forgave Eärendil for trespassing on the forbidden shores, and they honored his plea. They prepared for war, gathering their might for the first time since they had captured Morgoth ages before. And they set Eärendil in the sky, with the Silmaril upon his brow, to sail the heavens as a star, the brightest and most beautiful of all stars, a sign of hope for all who dwelt in darkness. This star you can see still, the evening and the morning star, and the elves call it Gil-Estel, the star of high hope, and they look upon it, and remember Eärendil and his sacrifice. The War of Wrath came, and it was the mightiest war ever fought in the history of the world. The Valar came with their full power, and with them came Vanya, who had never left Valinor, and who fought now for the first time, and many of the Noldor who had remained or turned back. They fell upon Morgoth's hosts, and the destruction was beyond imagination. Beleriand itself was broken by the violence of that war. Mountains fell and valleys flooded, coastlines crumbled into the sea, and whole regions vanished beneath the waves. The geography of the world was transformed utterly, and when the war was over, most of the lands where the great deeds of the First Age had occurred were gone, drowned beneath the sea that we now call Beligor. Morgoth was defeated at last. Angband was laid bare, and the Iron Crown was taken from his head, and the 2 Silmarils that remained in it were recovered. Morgoth himself was cast out of the world entirely, thrust through the door of night into the void beyond, where he will remain until the ending of all things. And what of the remaining sons of Fëanor? Only 2 survived to see the end of the war, Madrose and Maglor. They came to the camp where the Silmarils were kept, demanding them in fulfillment of their oath, and when they were refused, they stole them in the night. But the Silmarils rejected them. The jewels had been hallowed against unclean hands, and the hands of Madrose and Maglor were stained with the blood of their kindred. The Silmarils burned them, searing their flesh with unbearable agony. Madrose, driven mad by pain and despair, cast himself into a fiery chasm of the earth, and the Silmaril he carried was swallowed by the depths. Maglor cast his into the sea, and it was lost forever in the waters. and Maglo himself wandered away along the shores, singing laments for the sorrows of his people and the burden of his oath. And he was never seen again, though some say he wanders still, an immortal doomed to endless grief. So ended the first age of the world, and the tale of the Silmarils, and the great tragedy of the Noldor. When the war was over, the Valar offered pardon to all the exiled Noldor. Those who wished to return to Valinor were welcome, their sins forgiven, their exile ended. Many accepted, weary of war and sorrow, longing for the peace they had abandoned so long ago. They passed into the west, and were healed of their griefs, and they live there still in bliss, and their stories pass out of the knowledge of Middle-earth, but not all accepted. Some of the Noldor, and many of the Sindar who had never seen Valinor, chose to remain in Middle-earth. The world was wounded but not destroyed, and there was work to be done rebuilding, and some found they could not leave the Nanti had known, dark as they were. And so began the Second Age, with elves in both the east and the west, sundered by the sea but connected still by blood and memory. In Middle-earth, the great elven realm of the Second Age was Lindon, ruled by Gil-galad, last High King of the Noldor. Lindon lay west of the Blue Mountains, on a remnant of Beleriand that had survived the drowning. There were other realms too, a region near the Misty Mountains, where the elven smiths dwelt and made wonders, and eventually Rivendell, founded by Elrond, son of Eärendil, who had not chosen to follow his father, but to remain as an elf in Middle-earth. In Valinor, changes too were occurring. The Valar, chastened perhaps by the tragedy of the Noldor, lifted the ban on the Teleri of Alqualand, sailing to Middle-earth, and ships began to make the passage again. And on the lonely isle of Tol Eressë, elves dwelt who served as intermediaries between east and west, welcoming those who sailed from Middle-earth, and helping them adjust to the Undying lands. But the greatest gift of the Second Age was given not to the elves but to men. You see, the Valar had long pondered what to do about the race of men. Men were mortal, dying and leaving the world in a way that the Valar did not fully understand, for the fate of men was a secret known only to Vatar himself. Men could not dwell in Valinor, which was designed for immortal beings, but the Valar wished to reward those men who had fought faithfully against Morgoth. So they raised an island in the midst of the sea, closer to Valinor than to Middle-earth, and they gave it to the faithful men. This was Endir-Menna, the land of the star, and its people became the mightiest of men, long-lived and wise and skilled beyond any of their kindred who remained in Middle-earth. For a time all was well. The second was an age of peace and growth, with elves and men cooperating, with the shadow of Morgoth seemingly lifted forever. But evil is not so easily destroyed. Morgoth was gone, but his lieutenant remained. Sauron, who had been one of Morgoth's greatest servants, had hidden himself during the War of Wrath and escaped the judgment of the Valar. For a long time he lay quiet, but eventually his nature asserted itself. He could not be content without power, without dominion. He began to reach out, to seduce, to corrupt. It was to the elves he came first, in a fair form, calling himself Venatar, Lord of Gifts. He offered to teach them secrets that would increase their craft and power, and some listened, particularly the smiths of Regen. Together with them he forged the Rings of Power, magical artifacts of great potency that could slow the decay of time and preserve what was beloved. But Sauron betrayed them. Secretly, in the fires of Mount Doom in the land of Mordor, he forged a ring of his own, the One Ring, into which he poured much of his own power and malice. This ring was designed to control all the others, to dominate the wills of those who wore them and bend them to his purpose. When he put on the One Ring for the first time, the elves perceived his treachery. They felt his thought reaching for them through the rings, and they removed them and hid them, and thus escaped his control. War followed, and a region was destroyed, and Sauron recovered most of the rings he had helped create, but not all. The three greatest rings, which Celebrimbor had made without Sauron's direct aid, were kept by the elves, and they remained free of his direct influence, though still connected to his power through the making. The war went badly for the elves. Sauron's power grew, and he was on the verge of conquering all of Middle-earth when a new force entered the struggle. Cuiviénen, at the height of its power, sent a great fleet to the aid of the Elves, and Sauron's armies were broken, and he himself was taken captive to Cuiviénen. This proved to be a mistake, for Sauron was as cunning with words as Morgoth had ever been. Over many years he corrupted the hearts of the Undying, turning them from reverence of the Valar to worship of Morgoth, and inflaming in them a fear of death that drove them to madness. At last, under his influence, the king of Cuiviénen built a great armada and sailed against Valar itself, hoping to conquer the Unlands and seize immortality by force. The Valar laid down their guardianship and called upon Elvatar, and Elvatar responded. The fleet was swallowed by the sea, and Cuiviénen itself was drowned, sinking beneath the waves like Valyrian before it. And the shape of the world was changed, for the straight road to Valinor was removed from the world, and the Undying lands were taken out of the circles of the world entirely, and from that day forward, only the Elves could find the way west, for only their ships could sail the straight road that led to Valinor. Sauron's body was destroyed in the drowning, but his spirit endured, for so much of his power was in the ring that he could not truly die while it existed. He fled back to Mordor and slowly rebuilt his power, and in time he was strong enough to challenge the Free Peoples again. The last alliance was formed, the last great corporations and men against the darkness. Gil, Galad and Elendil, High King of the Noldor and High King of the surviving Mentuan, led their hosts against Mordor. They fought their way to Sauron's very door, and in a final desperate battle on the slopes of Mount Doom, they confronted the Dark Lord himself. Gil-galad died there, and Rildil too, but Isildur, Elendil's son, took up his father's broken sword and cut the ring from Sauron's hand. Sauron's physical form was destroyed, and his spirit full, and his power was broken. So ended the Second Age, and with it, the last great Elven kingdom in Middle-earth. Gil-galad had no heir, and the Noldor in Middle-earth declined rapidly there, their numbers dwindling, their realms shrinking. The Third Age was an age of fading, and I know it well, for it is my age, the age into which I was sent to walk these mortal lands. The Elves who remained in Middle-earth were mostly Cinder and Sylvan, with a few Noldor dwelling in hidden places like Rivendell. They were fewer with each passing year, for ever more of them answered the call of the sea and departed for the west. The world was increasingly given over to men, and the Elves knew that their time was ending, yet they did not abandon Middle-earth entirely. The Three Rings, still worn by their Elven keepers, worked their quiet magic, preserving what could be preserved, holding back the decay of time in small pockets of the ancient world. Rivendell endured, and Lothlorien, and the grey heavens from which the ship still sailed, and the shadow returned. Sauron, though his ring had been lost, gradually recovered. He built a new stronghold, at first at Dol Guldur in the southern reaches of Greenwood, and then again at his old citadel in Mordor. He searched always for his ring, knowing that if he regained it, his victory would be complete. You know this part of the story better than the earlier parts, perhaps. You know of the finding of the ring, and the long quest to destroy it, and the war of the ring that nearly ended in the triumph of Shadow. You know that the ring was destroyed at last, cast into the fires of Mount Doom where it was made, and Sauron was destroyed with it, his spirit dissipating into nothing, his power broken forever. And you know what happened after. With Sauron's destruction, the Three Rings lost their power, and the magic that had sustained the Elven realms faded. The time of the Elves was truly ending now, and even those who had their longest knew that they must depart. The ship that sailed from the grey heavens after the war, the last ship of the Ring-bearers, it carried many of the most important Elves who had remained in Middle-earth. Galadriel was on that ship, she who had been in Middle-earth since the rebellion of the Noldor, who had seen more ages and more sorrows than almost any living being. Elrond was there too, leaving behind the land he had guarded for thousands of years, and a daughter who had chosen mortality, and others friends dear to many. But not all the Elves departed at once. Some remained, and some remain still lingering in the fading forests, watching the world of men grow and spread. They will go eventually, all of them, for the call of the West cannot be resisted forever. And Middle-earth is no longer their home, if it ever truly was. And in Valinor, what happens there? The elves who have made the journey, all the Kindreds united at last after so many ages of sundering. What do they do in the Undying lands? They heal. They remember, they sing songs of all that has been, and they create new beauties, and they dwell in peace with the Valar and with each other. The old wounds close slowly, for elven memory is long, and some griefs never fully pass. But there is comfort there, and light in ending to sorrow. The Vanir are there, who never left, still fairest of all elves and most devoted to the powers. The Noldor who survived their long exile have returned, chastened and wise, their pride tempered by millennia of loss and struggle. The Teleri who stayed in Valinor have forgiven, or at least accepted, the kinslaying, and those who committed it and survived sought to make amends through long ages of humility and service. And the Sindar, they who never saw the trees, who were not part of the rebellion, who came to Valinor only at the end, they have found a place there too. It must be strange for them to see the glory their ancestors turned aside from so long ago, to understand at last what was offered and refused. But they are welcomed, and they add their own wisdom and their own songs to the harmony of the blessed rain. Even some of the Avari, it is said, have found their way west at last. Those who survived the dark ages in the Far East and never fully forgot the call of Valinor. They come as strangers to a land that was meant to be their home, and they learn what their ancestors refused to learn, and they become part of a great community of the Elder at last. So ends the tale of the Elven Kindreds, from their awakening at Cuiviénen beneath the stars to their final home in the Undying lands. It is a tale of beauty and sorrow intertwined, of choices made and consequences born, of light sought and light lost and light regained. You ask me what it all means, perhaps what lesson can be drawn from so long and so painful a history. I am not certain that I can give you a simple answer. The ways of Ilúvatar are deep, beyond understanding, and even those who read through these events do not fully comprehend them. But I can tell you this, the Elves were the firstborn, the elder kindred, and their story is in some ways the story of innocence and its loss. They awoke in a world of wonder, and they loved that world, and they were given the chance to live in paradise. Some chose to accept that gift, and some chose to refuse it, and those choices shaped everything that followed. The great tragedy of the Noldor was not that they rebelled against the Valar. It was that they rebelled for the wrong reasons, out of pride and possessiveness and wounded vanity. Eärfnor was perhaps the greatest of all elves in talent and in potential, and he squandered that greatness in pursuit of jewels, however beautiful those jewels might have been. He led his people into exile and war and kinslaying, and the price was paid not only by him, but by generations after him. And yet even in that tragedy, there was heroism and beauty. The Noldor did great deeds in Middle-earth, and they kept the light alive in the darkness, and they held back the shadow for centuries. Would it have been better if they had stayed in Valinor? Perhaps. But the world would have been poorer without their works and their sacrifices. And who is to say that Elvatar did not foresee all of this? Did not weave even the rebellion and the exile into his great design? The Sindar, two who stayed behind by accident or by choice, they contributed much to the history of Middle-earth. Thingol's kingdom was a beacon of civilization and culture, and the Sindarin tongue became the common language of all elves in Middle-earth, and their influence shaped much of what followed. And what of the Teleri, who lingered by the sea, who learned the ways of ships and shores? They too played their part, though often their part was to suffer at the hands of others. The kinslaying was a crime against them, but they were not erased by it. They endured, they forgave, they continued. In Valinor, they still sailed their white ships, and their songs still mingle with the murmur of the waves. Each kindred had its gifts and its flaws, its contributions and its failures. The Vanir were perhaps wisest in choosing to stay close to the light, but they also removed themselves from the struggles that shaped the world. The Noldor were boldest and most creative, but their boldness led them into darkness and crime. The Teleri were gentlest and most content, but their contentment made them slow to act and vulnerable to those who were less scrupulous. Perhaps that is the lesson, that there is one. No single approach to life is perfect. No single choice is without cost. The Elves, for all their wisdom and their beauty, were not perfect beings, and their history is marked by errors as much as by triumphs. They loved light, and they sought it, but the seeking sometimes led them into shadow, and now they are passing from Middle-earth. Their long stewardship ended. The world belongs to men now, and the Elves are becoming memories and legends, stories told by polite on dark evenings. Soon even those stories will fade, and the Elves will be forgotten entirely, save in Valinor where they dwell beyond the reach of mortal time. Is that sad? Yes, I think it is. But it is also as it should be. Everything has its time, and the time of the Elves in Middle-earth is over. They have done what they came to do, and now they rest. What remains is for others to continue, to build on what the Elves began, to carry the light forward in new ways and new forms. I have lived long among both Elves and men, and I have learned to love Kindreds, each for what they are. The Elves have beauty and wisdom that men can only aspire to. But men have a fire and a passion that the Elves lack, a willingness to risk all on a single throw that is foreign to the immortal temperament. Neither is superior, both are necessary. And both come from LOTR, from the same source, from the same secret fire that burns at the heart of all creation. In the end, that is what matters. Not whether one is firstborn or secondborn, elf or man or any other creature. What matters is that we are all children of the One, all part of his great design, all called to play our parts in the story he is telling. The story is not over. It will not be over until the end of all things. When Morgoth returns from the void, and the last battle is fought, and the world is broken and remade, the Elves will play at that final conflict, and so will men, and so will all the peoples of the world. What that part will be, none can say, for that lies beyond even my knowledge, and I have seen much. But I believe, in the depths of my heart, that the story will end well, that Iluvatar is good, and his design is good, and all the sorrows and tragedies are woven pattern that is ultimately beautiful. The Elves knew this, I think, in their best moments. It is why they could sing of grief and make it lovely. It is why they could face despair and not be destroyed by it. They knew that beyond the darkness was light, and beyond the ending was beginning. You have been patient, listening to this old man ramble on about ages long past and peoples you will never meet. I thank you for your patience. The hour grows late, and the fire burns low, and perhaps it is time for other tales, or for silence, or for sleep. But remember what I have told you. When you look up at the stars and see Jill, they're still shining bright in the heavens. Remember that a great hero sails there still, bearing a treasure beyond price, a light that cannot be dimmed. Remember that the Elves loved that light and followed it, and were sometimes led astray but never wholly lost it. And remember that the light is for all of us, not just for Elves. It shines on men as well, and on every creature that lifts its eyes to the sky. The Elves were the first to see it, but they will not be the last. The story continues, and you are part of it. And your choices matter as much as the choices of Heavenerne or Thingol, or any other great figure of the ancient days. What do you choose, I wonder? Will you follow the light, or turn away from it? Will you seek beauty and wisdom, or will you let pride and fear lead you into shadow? The choice is yours, as it would choose well. And there? I have told you of the Elven Kindreds. From their awakening to their departure, from Cuiviénen to the Undying lands, it is not a complete telling, for that would take years beyond counting, but it is enough, perhaps, to give you a sense of who they were and what they meant. And now, if you will forgive me, I believe I will enjoy a bit more of this excellent pipeweed and watch the flames dance. The fire reminds me of many things, of the two trees and of Ephranor's doom, and of the burning ships of Losgar, but also of the warmth of elven halls and the light of friendship. and the enduring hope that has carried us all through so many dark nights. The light endures, you see. That is the final lesson of the Elves. No matter how deep the darkness, the light endures. It may be hidden, it may seem to fail, but is never truly extinguished. The Silmarils are gone, but their light lives on in the Star of Edirendil. The two trees are dead, but sun and moon still shine. The Elves are passing from Middle-earth, but their works and their wisdom remain. And those who come after can build upon them. The light endures. Remember that when the night seems darkest and hope seems gone. Remember the Elves and their long journey, their sorrows and their triumphs. Remember that they walked this same earth, looked up at these same stars, and found beauty even in grief and hope even in despair. And know that you are not alone. You are part of a story that stretches back to the beginning of all things and forward to the ending of the world. Your chapter is brief, perhaps, compared to the chapters of the Elves, but it is no less important for that. Every choice matters. Every act of courage or kindness or beauty adds to the sum of light in the world. So go forth, when you leave this comfortable hobbit hole and return to the wider world. Go forth and be part of the story. Seek the light and share it with others. Remember the Elves, and honor their memory by living well and choosing wisely. That is all any of us can do, in the end. That is all the Elves did for all their millennia of existence. They lived, and they chose, and they added their part to the great song of creation. And when their part was done, they rested, knowing that the song goes without them, carried forward by new voices and new melodies. The song goes on, it will always go on, and you, my friend, have your own part to sing. I look forward to hearing it. Now then, I have talked quite enough for one evening. The fire is comfortable, the chair is soft, and there is still pipeweed in my pouch. Let us sit in companionable silence for a while, and let the stories we have shared settle into your memory. Tomorrow brings its own tales, as every tomorrow does. But tonight, let us simply be, and be grateful for the warmth and the light and the gift of each other's company. May the stars shine upon your path, as they shone upon the Elves at Cuiviénen long ago. May you find the light you seek wherever that light may lead you. And may your story, when it is told, be one of beauty and courage and hope. That is my wish for you, and it is the same wish that the Elves have always offered to those they love. May it be so, may it always be so. The Elves are passing, but their blessing remains. Carry it with you and pass it on to others. That is how the light endures. That is how the story continues. That is how we honor those who came before and those who will come after. And with that, I believe I have said all that needs to be said, at least for tonight. The tale of the Elven Kindreds is complete, or as any telling can make it. The rest is silence and memory, and the slow turning of the stars. Thank you for listening. It has been my privilege to share this tale with you. May you carry with you always a light in dark places, a reminder of what has been and what can be. The Elves have given us much, but perhaps their greatest gift is the gift of hope. May you never lose it, no matter what comes. And now, truly, I must rest. Even wizards grow weary sometimes, and the hour is very late. Sleep well when you find your bed. Dream of starlight and music and the beauty of the elder days. And wake tomorrow ready to add your own chapter to the never-ending story. Farewell for now. Until we meet again in this world and another. May the blessing of the Elves go with you always.